So there's this pastor who decides he needs to be more consistent in keeping the laws, especially the way he drives. And so he decides he's going to begin doing a lot better job of that. And he's out driving one day, and he's coming to an intersection where there's a traffic light, and he knows it's a traffic light that has a camera on it. And so he's driving, he kind of slows down, he's watching the light real closely, he's making sure he's under the speed limit, and he proceeds through the intersection, and it's just dusk where it's starting to get a little dark, and he thinks he sees a flash, and he goes, "What was that? That came from that camera. They took my picture for some reason. That was interesting. I'm obeying the speed limit, the light wasn't red, and all these other things," and it just got his curiosity up. So he got a block later, and he looped back around. He's going through the intersection the same way again, and he's very careful, and the light turns yellow, and he stops, even though it isn't red yet, not much to the chagrin of the person behind him, and he waits till it turns green, and he goes through, and he sees that again. And he's going, "That thing must be taking a picture of everybody today for some reason. Maybe they're just checking everybody." And he got his curiosity up, so he went around one more time, and he's going to go through the third time. And this time he's going through the intersection very carefully, and he's waving because he just thought, "Oh, that'll be fun." And he sees that same flash, and he goes, "Well, okay, they're just taking a picture of everybody, and I'm okay." And 3 days later, he got 3 citations for not wearing a seatbelt. Well, thank you for groaning and laughing. It encourages me. You know, it seems like, anyway, there's less and less integrity in ministry today. Just watch the news and you see that. Here's what I've seen just in the news in the last week. There was a popular hip-hop Christian artist who lost his contract with his Christian label because he was caught sending pornographic pictures to minors. That's just happened this last week. There was a pastor in Maryland. This actually happened before, but I happened to catch the headline this week. There was a pastor in Maryland who was arrested because for a number of years he's been performing bogus marriages with illegal aliens to get them on the fast track to citizenship. And he was arrested for that. If you haven't followed the last few years, the whole saga of Jerry Falwell Jr., he was in the news again this week, and basically in the news saying, "Well, I never really had faith anyway." And so it's a sad story. And we see these things, I see these things over and over again in the news. It just seems it's getting harder and harder for people in ministry to maintain integrity. I think it's getting harder as culture gets further from Christianity to maintain integrity. I think it gets harder as the government gets more and more oppressive of Christianity. It gets harder and harder to maintain integrity. And sometimes situations come up where we even struggle as Christians. What is the right thing to do? What is the integrity thing to do? I had that struggle this fall when the mask mandate came back in our county, and was I going to wear a mask on Sunday morning or not, and really debated with that, and now it's lifted, so I don't have that debate, but for a few weeks I had that debate, and there were some of you that did and said we need to obey what the government's saying, and a lot of you who didn't, and the first week I didn't, and I felt kind of bad about it, and the next week I did, and I struggled with that, and I realized that more of you were more comfortable if I didn't have one on than with, and part of the struggle was, how much do you open the door of allowing the government to come in here and tell us what we can do? And so I struggled with the whole freedom thing, with the obey the government thing, and I had to struggle with it. And I probably landed on the wrong side, because wearing a mask isn't affecting your faith in any way. It does affect when we sing and do other things, but I struggled with that. And it really is. It's a struggle. As more of those things come up, how do you maintain integrity as a Christian? How do you maintain integrity in ministry? One of our concerns as Christian ministers, and it should be as Christian people in general, is living a life that's consistent with the message that we proclaim. That should be a major concern of ours, and not just people in ministry, anybody who claims to know Christ. It should be a concern that their life is consistent with the message. Paul and Silas and Timothy visited a town called Thessalonica, and they started a church there. And not long after that, Paul wrote them a letter, and we started this letter. This is week 4, I believe, and we've been in this for a number of weeks now, and we're working our way through this letter all the way until Easter. And so what we see in the next section that we're looking at, which is the beginning of chapter 2, is that Paul and his companions lived a life that was consistent with their message. And we see how he did that as we go through this passage today. This book begins with Paul giving thanks. All the way through the first chapter of this book, Paul is giving thanks for that congregation there in the city of Thessalonica. He gives thanks because they worked hard. He talks about their work of faith and their labor of love. He talks about their steadfastness of hope, things that he's giving thanks for. He then gives thanks because he says, I know God chose you because the evidence is how receptive you were to God's word and to God's speaking. And then he goes on to say, I'm thankful because the message is going out from you. And we talked about that one last week as we took time to pray for and hear from a number of our missionaries. The word was going out, and he was giving thanks for that. He goes on today to talk about his and Silas and Timothy's character in doing all of this. And probably the phrase that captures it as much as anything, he says, we were like a nursing mother in our care for you. Isn't that a beautiful phrase? We were like a nursing mother. And we'll see how that comes up in this passage. It starts in chapter 2, and Paul goes from, we know God has worked in your life because the way you responded to his word, because of the word going out from you. And then he continues by saying, our coming to you was not in vain. Our coming to you had an impact. And that's what he'd been talking about in the early part of the chapter. It's still having an impact. And it's visible to us. It's visible to others. You're making a difference. God's making a difference in your life. And through you, he's making a difference in the lives of others. And even though we faced a lot of conflict when we were with you, we had boldness to declare the message. We had boldness to declare the message. That word boldness is an interesting word because it's used in the New Testament in only a couple different ways. It's used to describe the freedom that we have who know Jesus Christ to come into God's presence. It's often translated confidence. We have confidence to come into the throne of grace because of what Jesus has done, because he's taken our sin away, because he's removed the gap that separates us from God because of our sin and shortcomings, because he's covered that gap. We can come with confidence into God's throne room. We can come before him with our prayer requests. And that's a way the word is used. But the other way the word is used is when followers of Jesus openly declare the word of God. They have boldness. They openly declare the word of God. When the Apostle Paul had been a persecutor of the church in Jerusalem, and he'd gone to Damascus, and you probably know the story how Jesus appeared to him on that way to Damascus and changed his life. When he got to Damascus, he went into the synagogue and started preaching about Jesus being the Messiah. And when Paul came back to Jerusalem and tried to join the followers of Jesus, they didn't want anything to do with him. This is the guy that was killing us. They thought he was probably just having some pretext for getting in and killing more people. But a man named Barnabas brought Paul into the apostles, and he said, this man boldly proclaimed Jesus as Messiah when he was in Damascus. And later, Paul and Barnabas traveled on a missionary journey together, and it says that they boldly proclaimed the message of Jesus. And you see how that word is used, and it's used in this situation in the same way. In other words, every time this word appears, it appears as a boldness that can only come from God. It's not a courage or boldness we generate within ourselves. It's something that God puts in our lives. It's something that he gives us because of Jesus Christ to come into his presence. It's something he gives us by the Spirit to proclaim his truth when we get those opportunities. And so that's what they were doing. And they did that in spite of conflict, in spite of persecution. We've pointed out every week in this series, and that's why we've called it Living the Gospel, even in affliction. because that church started with persecution and continued to have affliction and persecution. And Paul says we were bold to speak even in the midst of that. But not only did we speak the message, we lived it. Not only did we speak the message, we lived it. Our lives were consistent with that message. Probably, he comes up with a list of things they were not, and it's a long negative list. There's 7 things on it. We'll walk through those in a minute. But probably those things came from a couple of things. One, from what false teachers of the day were doing. And we'll see how a lot of them were doing some of the things Paul said we didn't do, or we weren't that. But also, there was probably, in Thessalonica, with all the opposition that Christians were facing, there was probably a party of people saying, Paul was a false teacher, look what he did, look what they did together, look what this team did. And we're pointing out that they were probably false teachers because of that opposition. And so what he does in this letter, he goes through those charges that could have been made and shows how that they are false charges. And he says 6 times in various ways, you already know this. You remember this. You already know this. He says it 6 different times. And so what he's doing in this letter, he's going to the Thessalonians, to the congregation there, and he's saying, you already know the truth. Just let the record stand. You know who we are. You know who we proved to be when we were with you. So with that said, listen as I read the passage. It's a longer one than we've gone through as we've worked through Thessalonians so far. I'm going to read 12 verses, and so hang with me, and I think you'll have a lot to learn from it. But watch how often he says, you already know this, or you remember this, and all the negative things that they weren't, and then the positive things that they were. 1 Thessalonians 2, 1-12. You yourselves know, brothers, that our coming to you is not in vain. But though we had already suffered and been shamefully treated at Philippi, as you know, we had boldness in our God to declare to you the gospel of God in the midst of much conflict. For our appeal does not spring from error or impurity or any attempt to deceive, but just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak not to please man, but to please God who tests our hearts. For we never came with words of flattery, as you know, nor with a pretext for greed. God is witness. Nor did we seek glory from people, whether from you or from others, though we could have made demands as apostles of Christ. But we were gentle among you, like a nursing mother taking care of her own children. So being affectionately desirous of you, we were ready to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you had become very dear to us. For remember, brothers, our labor and toil. We worked night and day that we might not be a burden to any of you while we proclaim the gospel of God. You are witnesses, and God also, how holy and righteous and blameless was our conduct towards you believers. For you know how like a father with his children, we exhorted each one of you and encouraged you and charged you to walk in a manner worthy of God who calls us into his own kingdom and glory. Well, there's a long list of negative things. Paul says our message didn't spring from these things. Let me walk you through them and see what they are. Number 1, our message didn't spring from error. Paul was not a false teacher. Timothy and Silas were not false teachers. They weren't giving false witness. They weren't wolves in sheep's clothing, as Jesus put it. And the Thessalonians knew that because they knew the gospel they had accepted is a gospel that Paul got from God. And he often calls it the gospel of God or the gospel from God. They knew that it wasn't a false message, and their lives testified to that as well. It didn't spring from impurity, is the second one. Impurity. That's a word that often means sexual sin. It can have a much broader meaning. But here's what's interesting. Some of the commentaries pointed out that in that day, there were philosophers and false teachers going around gathering a following just so they could gain sexual favors from the followers. Things never change, do they? We see that happening today as well. And not everybody in ministry that gets into trouble that way is that way, but there are some who are. And things just don't change. Look at verse 10, where he not only mentions impurity in verse 3, but in verse 10 he comes back and he says, "You are witnesses in God also, how holy and righteous and blameless was our conduct towards you believers." There are three words there that just have a lot of overlap in meaning. And you get the message of what Paul is trying to say. Look at our lives. We didn't live in impurity. The third one is we didn't come with deception. Our message didn't spring from deception. That's a word that means tricking people into believing something. It's the word that would be used when you put bait on a fish hook or when you put a piece of cheese on a mouse trap. You bait something so somebody is drawn or something is drawn to that bait, and then when they get too close, they're caught. And that's the exact thing that some of the Greek philosophers of the day were doing. They would travel around and they had their trickery to deceive people, to become their followers. By the way, that's exactly what many of the faith healers that were so popular, particularly in the 1940s to the 1970s, would do. And I can't say all of them were fake, but so many of them they knew the psychology, they knew how it worked. And there was a young man named Marjo, who was a faith healer, and he went back and made a documentary to show how fake it all was and show how the psychology worked into it and everything else. And it's the same thing. It's putting something out there that attracts people and then getting them trapped in that teaching so that it will do something good for you. We didn't do that, as you know. The fourth one, they weren't men pleasers. We didn't come to please men. People pleasing can be addictive, and it is especially addictive for people in ministry, because we want to please the people that we're ministering to. I didn't know how much of a problem this was until I was actually looking for some sort of fun picture to put up there, and started finding thousands of websites that deal with the problem of being a people pleaser. And it was interesting to find all of those. And it's so common. I want to mention to you some of the signs that you're a people pleaser. And these showed up on every site I looked at. I didn't look at thousands of them. I just know they were there. But a number of them said the inability to say no. If you can't say no to someone, you're probably a people pleaser. Trouble making simple decisions. You need input from someone else. You need to make sure somebody else approves of that decision. Or just often apologizing for the littlest things. If you do those, maybe you are a people-pleasing addict, as it says. But the websites I looked at, the solution was always the same. You quit pleasing others and you start pleasing yourself. You put the focus off of others and on yourself. Paul says that we were not there to please people, but his solution was better than that. His solution was, we are about pleasing God, not about pleasing self. Listen again to verse 4. Just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak not to please man, but to please God who tests our hearts. The solution of being addicted to people-pleasing is learn how to please God, not how to please yourself. And that's exactly what Paul and Timothy and Silas did. They considered the gospel a gift from God. They considered the message a trust from God. They considered themselves stewards of God's message. And a steward, his job is not to please everyone else. His job is to please the master who owns what he takes care of. And they were good stewards in the sense their goal was to please God, not to please men. And so they spoke boldly because of that. Number 5. He says we never came with flattery down in verse 5. Flattery means giving empty praise, giving approval or attention to someone so they'll be receptive of your message. There's an old Japanese proverb I came across this week that says flattery is the best way to persuade people. Flattery is the best way to persuade people. It's been a sales trick from the beginning of time. That how often have you been in a sales pitch and he's praising you for all kinds of things? We are getting new windows in our house. They're supposed to arrive this week or the following week. And a couple of years ago, we'd contacted a number of companies, and this year we contacted a few more. And we had a salesman come in our house, and he had all these little tiny sample windows, and he was showing us everything, and he was saying things like, you're smart enough to see this. Or that kind of phrase constantly kept coming up in the sales pitch. And Kathy and I said later, it didn't feel like communication, it felt like manipulation. And you've had that feeling. And that's exactly what I ran across this week, that one of the commentators said, flattery is not communication, it's manipulation. And if you've sat under one of those sales pitches or you've been a victim of one of those sales pitches, you know what I mean. You feel like you've been manipulated. And you can ask about Windows if you want. It's a long story, what we ended up doing. But you've been in that situation where you feel manipulated because when it's all done, you were flattered. And Paul says, we didn't do that. We didn't do that. In fact, what he told them is if you're going to be a follower of Jesus, you're going to face persecution and trouble. You can look in chapter 3, I think it's verse 4, where he told them that. So he wasn't flattering them. He was telling them as it is. This is going to bring trouble your way. He says, for we never came to you with words of flattery, as you know. Number 6, they didn't come with greed. Or really, we should say a pretext for greed. Greed is a desire for more and tricking other people to get that more from them, really to extort them. That's what greed is in this kind of setting. We didn't come with a pretext for greed. Our message was not something that was out there to hide the fact that we were getting things from you. That didn't happen, and you know that didn't happen. In fact, it's interesting that Paul's practice, as best we can tell from what he said to a number of his churches and the way he was supported, Paul's practice was to never take any gifts from the church that he was ministering to if he was beginning that church. If that was a church that was just getting started, he didn't take gifts from them. But once a church was started and he traveled somewhere else, he would encourage them to support their ministry. And if you read in the book of Philippians, you'll find out that while Paul was in Thessalonica and probably while he was in Berea and Athens, the church in Philippi was sending him gifts. That was a part of his support as a missionary. It came from the churches that were already established. He had this practice of never asking a church that he was started to give him anything. And so they knew that he didn't come with greed. If you look at verse 9, it says, you remember, brothers, our labor and our toil. We worked night and day that we might not be a burden to any of you while we proclaim to you the gospel of God. Paul worked with his own hands. He found business. He was a tent maker or a leather worker. Word could mean either one of those. And he found businesses where he could work. And he says, we worked night and day. Doesn't mean he worked 24 hours, but he means he worked at night so he could preach during the day, or he worked during the day so he could preach at night, so people could hear the gospel without being burdened financially. That was his practice. And finally, number 7, he says, our message didn't spring from self-glory. Verse 6, nor do we seek glory from people, whether from you or from others, though we could have made demands on you as apostles of Christ. It's interesting, he moves from material goods to honor and prestige. And honor and prestige, one of the commentators said, is every bit as much a potent temptation to people in ministry as money and things are. In my mind, it's a far stronger one. There are plenty of preachers out there that have this motive. They just like getting the attention and getting honor and getting self-glory. And to be honest, it's hard to avoid. When somebody says that's a great message, there's the spiritual pride that wants to say, thank you, I did that. But I really know that if God speaks through this time, it's his speaking, it's not me. And I have to constantly remind myself of that because that spiritual pride can come up, and it's easy to be motivated by self-glory. And Paul says we weren't in that situation at all. So there's the negative things. Paul says our message didn't spring from any of these 7 things, but we were, and he goes through 3 positive things that I want you to see what their lives were. That begins in verse 7. Number 1, he says, we were gentle. But we were gentle among you like a nursing mother taking care of her own children. Isn't that a beautiful picture? A gentle mother taking care of her own children. Now there's a couple interesting translation debates on this verse. One's a translation debate, one's a textual debate. And they're kind of interesting. It says nursing mother in this translation, and a lot of English translations say that. The only word there is the word nurse. We were like a nurse among you. But the reason some of the translations put in nursing mother is because it says taking care of her own children. And the word nurse can be a pretty generic word until you realize this nurse is taking care of her own children. And so he said a nursing mother, that's the way it's translated, to get the picture across that Paul is trying to get. And so that's one interesting thing. Another interesting thing of this verse is there's an interesting textual debate because most of your translations will say, we were gentle among you. But you might have a translation that says we were infants or we were babies among you. And you might say, how do they get those things confused? It is a fascinating debate of textual criticism. If you don't know what textual criticism is, you have to play my manuscript game. And we're hoping to find a date to do that soon. But anyway, there is a change in some of the manuscripts. Some of them say infant and some of them say gentle. And the words are very close together in Greek that this was written in. Just one letter different, and it's a letter that could have easily been skipped or added because of where it falls in the text. It's an interesting debate, but most of the translations fall on gentle simply because it fits the context better. If he says, we were infants among you, like a nursing mother taking care of her children, it just doesn't connect. But everything in here is about being a mother, about being affectionate, about so on. And so the gentle just seems to make the context flow a little better without breaking that thought. And so that's why most of the translations put that in there. But put all that aside now. Okay? Those are debates. Those are things that we talk about when we're doing Bible study. But put all that aside for a minute. Don't let that discussion get in the way of the beautiful picture that's painted here. Because I think what Paul wants to see is this beautiful picture, a nursing mother taking care of her children. That's how we were among you. It gives us a picture of Paul's heart for this congregation. And I told you in the beginning, this is a book that reveals Paul's pastoral heart for his people. You know, forget for a moment that Paul was this very harsh, exacting theologian. Because what is being expressed here is an incredible heart for his people. And I think that's what we need to see and what we need to feel. We were gentle among you. The second word is we were affectionate in verse 8. Being affectionately desirous of you, we were ready to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you had become very dear to us. Affectionate is a strong word. It's the only place it's used in the New Testament is right here. And it's just that strong kind of attraction word. And again, it shows Paul's heart for this congregation, that he really had an affection for them more than some of his congregations. And so we see that pastor's heart. In fact, he says our affection was so great that we wanted to share our very lives with you. Now, the word share is a good word. Some translations will say we wanted to give our lives to you. But when you read in English, to give a life, you think of a sacrifice. And that may be what Paul and his companions did at times, but that's not what's meant here at all. What is meant here is the kind of life that lovers have when they want to spend time together. They want to be with each other. That's the kind of life sharing that's being expressed in this passage. Every October for the last number of years, someone has given us a gift to say this is for a winter retreat. And Kathy and I are going to be gone a couple days this week because we're taking our winter retreat away. But we always look forward to it because it's time together without the pressures of the world. It's that unhurried time where we can just share life together. That's the kind of intimacy that's expressed in this word. We were so affectionate, we just wanted to share who we were. We wanted to share our lives together with you. Isn't that a beautiful picture? That's who we should be as Christians when we minister to other people. There's always, and it's especially strong for me, this temptation to keep to myself, to not share life. I don't know if it's any worse because my gift is towards teaching and preaching and so on, but I'm more than the concern and empathy kind of gift, so maybe I struggle with that more. But it's always a temptation to keep to myself, where the example Paul set, even as a teacher, even as a theologian, was we shared our lives together. And that's, I think, a great example of how we do ministry. We share our lives with people. Gentle, affectionate, and then number 3, encouraging. Encouraging. Verses 11 and 12, he says, we encourage you like a father. Again, he gives 3 words that have a lot of overlap in meaning. Verse 11, we know, or you know, how like a father with his children, we exhorted each one of you, encouraged you, and charged you to walk in a manner worthy of God. 3 words with a lot of overlap. And I would encourage you, don't get into the nuances of those words because I don't think it's significant. I think Paul could have used any one of those words to express what he had, but he puts one on top of the other to give the feeling of the concern that he had for this church. He considered congregations that he had helped start as his spiritual children. He considered himself their spiritual father. And the job of a good father is to encourage children. And that's what he said we did. People need encouragement. Children need encouragement. But people need encouragement, especially if they're facing affliction, conflict, persecution. And Paul said that's what we were. We were encouragers when we were with you. And notice the goal of his encouragement is to walk worthy of God who calls you into his kingdom and glory. To walk worthy of God. That's what Paul and Silas and Timothy were encouraging this church to do. It doesn't say walk worthy so that God will accept you. It says because God calls you already into his kingdom, we want you to walk worthy of that calling. And that's what he was encouraging them to do. We weren't all these negative things. Instead, we were gentle, affectionate, and encouraging. I think if you want a key verse, it's 1 Thessalonians 2:8. And I memorized this in a different translation years ago, but it's a constant reminder to me. Having a fond affection for you, we were well pleased to impart to you not only the gospel of God, but also our own lives, because you were very dear to us. I think that gives the heart of what's going on in this passage. It's so contrary to our self-centered culture. How much in our culture forces us to be self-centered, to be a people to ourselves? People don't have patios on the front anymore or porches. They have patios and porches on the back. All of our yards have 6-foot privacy fences. I mean, so much in our culture is geared towards looking at self and not sharing lives with others. But as Christian people, I think we need to be open to sharing our life with others and with other Christians and non-believers as well. And so that's a good verse to look at and think about. The big idea is that Paul and Silas and Timothy were great examples of this. They were great examples of integrity and love. The first one's integrity. That's what's in verses 2 through 5 and verse 10. as we walked through it. They were great examples of integrity. If you want to use a different word, put authenticity in there, because the message they proclaimed is the message they lived. They were so concerned for the integrity of the gospel message that they avoided any kind of behavior that could possibly bring that message into question. They avoided any kind of behavior that could do that. They were committed to the gospel because it was a trust from God, and they were going to be good stewards of that trust. They preached it even in opposition, and they lived it even in opposition. There's always temptation to preach what people want to hear. There's always temptation to live what the culture says to live. There's always temptation to deceive and to flatter and to speak out of greed. But all those things can undermine the truth of the gospel message. And so Paul and Timothy and Silas said they were very careful not to do that. They were great examples of integrity. They were also great examples of love. They allowed God's love to overflow from their lives, and so they got involved in the lives of their people, especially this church in Thessalonica. They were great examples of integrity and love. Here's the application for us. As a church, we must model integrity and love. As a church, we must model integrity and love. That's especially true in today's world. Most people who walk through that door that we don't know on any given Sunday have never experienced the genuine love of a healthy family. Most people that walk through that door, so many of our people come from broken families. The majority of people come from broken families. And that's the experience that they've had. And as a church, we have to model that integrity and that love to them because they've never seen it. They've never seen it because so few churches model this kind of integrity and love. Churches modeling integrity, again, look at the news headlines. One I didn't mention I ran across this week is the founding pastor of Hillsong in Australia, which is a worldwide church now. It's had a huge impact, particularly with worship. He stepped down from his position because of charges of sexual abuse cover-up. Now, the charges aren't that he was abusing somebody, but that he covered up abuse from someone else. Now, his lawyers told him it was best to take a year and deal with the charges rather than try to be in the forefront of a church like that. I don't know if he's innocent or guilty, but the media and the world has already judged him as guilty. And that's how the media works when it comes to churches. The media plays up these kinds of things all the time. And so they don't see a lot of integrity in the church. They don't see a lot of love in the church either. In fact, as an evangelical church over the last couple of generations, we haven't done a great job of this. You know, the builder generation and my baby boomer generation have been real good at standing up for truth as a church, speaking the truth, but we don't do a really good job of loving the sinner. And what I've seen is an interesting swing of the pendulum, because what I see in the millennial generation is people that really love the sinners, but they haven't been as bold to speak the truth about sin. And that's a really hard balance to deal with. I don't know how to deal with it. I grew up on that side that isn't very loving, and I struggle with how to deal with it. There's very few churches that demonstrate integrity and love in the right way. You know, one of the things I love about being in a small church is that we can be a family and we can demonstrate that love and we can demonstrate that integrity far easier than the large churches can. And I hope that's something you've seen if you've been around here very long. But we have to model it because very few churches do. We have to model integrity and love because very few leaders do. Just, again, open the news and look at it. If you don't see a lack of love and integrity, well, open a whole bunch of liberal news websites and see how much they slam the conservatives. Then open a bunch of conservative news sites and see how much they slam the integrity of the liberals. It goes both ways. There really isn't a lot of integrity and love amongst leaders today, so people don't see it modeled So we should be modeling that. And finally, there's very few families that model integrity and love. And so as a Christian people, we have to live the gospel in our families. We have to live out the morality, the forgiveness, the honesty, and the integrity that the scriptures spell out. And we must do it with a spirit of gentleness. Think about that. The fruit of the Spirit is gentleness. When God's Spirit is in our lives, we will deal with people in a gentle manner. People will know we are Jesus followers. It's not because of what we say. It's because of how we live our lives. It is because we love. That's how the world will know that we are Jesus followers. And we need to live that kind of life and that kind of integrity that people will know that we are Jesus followers, that are consistent with the message that we speak.